Uh, Hello, everyone. We've just started streaming live now on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So if you're joining us on any of those platforms, welcome. You can always feel free to share texts or messages throughout today's session. It's the first Thursday of October and it's 7 p.m. UK time. So it's time for analytics driven strategy, LinkedIn Live. Today's session is super exciting because I got a lot of questions asking about Agile, and I have L'Oreal Giles with me. Hello, L'Oreal.
Hello there. Excited to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you as well. So, we will be chatting about Agile methodology and answering your questions. So, I'll give a brief introduction. So, my name is El-Wakeel. I am an analytics strategy evangelist, and I create strategies and ecosystems for the create the right strategies and ecosystems for successful analytics transformation. With me today is L'Oreal Giles. L'Oreal is an Agile and Scrum advocate, robotic process automation evangelist. She's currently leading the research and thought leadership function at the Institute of Management Accountants in the US. Welcome again, L'Oreal.
Yes, thank you. Delighted to be here and to talk about the topic.
Yes, it's super
Yeah.
exciting having you here today. And speaking about Agile, so I'm having my phone with me because just want to make sure that I can read all your messages
Yeah.
and answer your questions. So I'll keep that with me here. And yeah, feel free to ask your questions on the chat. Again, we're on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and that will be on the podcast next month. So, L'Oreal, let's speak a bit about Agile
Yeah.
and maybe discuss more about agility in the business. People kind of speak about agile with a capital A versus the normal agile as, something you do being
Yes,
agile.
yes, yes.
So, and you've just wrote actually a great statement that I was very honored to kind of really kind of review as a practitioner. But chat
Yes,
to me more about writing the paper and about your thoughts about agile with a capital A and agile with a small a.
certainly. So the paper is called An Agile Approach to Finance Transformation, and it's a statement on management accounting that's been published through IMA, through the Institute of Management Accountants. And I'm really excited about it because it's not something that we talk about often in the finance space. We hear it traditionally in the software development space, in your IT functions of your organizations. And so really excited to be able to bring some of those learnings forward to the finance and accounting realm. So when we think about, let's start Agile with a capital A. Agile with a capital A is traditionally referring to Agile methodology or Agile, the software development lifecycle. They call them SDLCs. There are multiple ones, but Agile is the one we're focused on today. And it's focused on iterative, incremental delivery. And that's by self-organizing or cross-functional teams. So historically, we heard of the waterfall approach. The waterfall approach is another software development lifecycle. So all of this originating in the IT space, in the computer science or the computer engineering space. But with software development for waterfall, that effectively means it's a phased or a linear approach. And I'd say the depiction we normally see is these phases trickling down like a waterfall.
The
So you're
Gantt
going
chart.
from one, yes, in chunks from one to the next.
Yes.
So that's what we had seen for decades, I'd say it that way. And what a realization occurred to a group of folk, probably to many, but a specific group of folk got together, the Agile Alliance, several years back, and they met and said, actually, I think there's a better way that we could deliver software. And there's a more flexible way, a way to ensure that it meets the requirements of the business that we're supporting, a way to ensure that it's most relevant for the end users, to deliver it more efficiently, and to ensure that there's maximum value that will be reaped from the end product that they prepare. And that translated into them writing the Agile Manifesto, which anyone can go and look up. So you can Google that and go look at agilemanifesto.org if you want to learn more just about the history of how that group came about. what they did after they finished writing the Agile Manifesto was effectively said that we've come up with a better way or an alternative way to be able to deal with complex problems, to be able to deal with complex products, and to deliver them not in a linear and phased approach, but in an iterative and incremental approach, which means in most instances, you get to reap value much sooner than the end of the project. And so Agile with a capital A is referring to the Agile software development lifecycle, the Agile SDLC. So if we shift gears to the other side of that, to agility. So when I think about it in the terms of finance and the finance function, we think about an agile finance function as an adjective. What does that mean? And so I went about to have a host of interviews with lots of stakeholders within the profession. And the goal there was to figure out, what does an agile finance function really look like? What's the benefit of having an agile finance function? And everyone talks about we need to be more agile. And so in that context, my goal was, how do we identify what the criteria are? And so when we think about agility, it's this ability to anticipate and then efficiently respond to change. So how do we efficiently and effectively respond to change? How do we make sure we're anticipating it? And an agile finance function is able to do that because they've embedded agility within the culture. And so I'll throw out a couple of characteristics of agile finance functions, and then we'll shift back to Fatima to see where we take the conversation next. So an agile finance function, you think about scalable, efficient operations, transparent, accessible data and metrics. You've got frequent inspection. So people are always having opportunities to look at what you're developing, what you're working on, to ensure that the end product will be fit for purpose. And then quick, responsible adaptation to change. So that gets back to the traditional definition of agility.
Mhm.
And then empowered, capable, and multidisciplinary teams. So not having the silos within the function.
Yes, I love how you kind of explained, Agile and how it actually developed, because a lot of people don't know how the methodology started and,
Mm-hmm.
um, this kind of, the framework and how they got together to create it and how it actually originated
Yes.
from the software teams. And I think the bit that you compared the agile to the normal or traditional project management is really important because agile agile is very, as you said, iterative and it
Mm-hmm.
changes. And as a practitioner actually doing agile and running data and analytics projects in an agile way, or a capital agile methodology where we have the team, the scrum master and the product owner and all that, is really important because a lot of the things, I think, when I look at it from a practitioner perspective, um, a, when you run it in the traditional method, you have the outcome, you have the scope, and you have to reach that scope. And people are fixated on it, and you might not be, get in touch with your stakeholder a lot to get this kind of feedback. While with agile, we get this all the time. So maybe even sometimes the scope that we want changes because it's
Yes.
not useful for the business anymore. Because as a business, we change.
Absolutely.
Um, so I love how you highlighted the iterative thing because it is so important. It's so valuable for the business. Um, and you mentioned finance, and to be honest, it's finance and outside finance,
Yes.
purchasing. It's like all the functions are
Definitely.
really. So let's deep dive a bit more into. Shall we compare more traditional? Because I know it's a chat. Shall we compare more traditional versus agile, L'Oreal, or shall we just go and actually deep dive into agile and explain more the scrums and all
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I think let's deep dive.
Let's
Let's
deep.
go.
Let's
Yes,
go.
yes. No, it's good. So I'm happy to go there. When we think about agile, the capital A, agile,
Mhm.
there are a host of branches. There's lean. Some people may have heard of lean. You may have heard of Kanban or Kanban,
Hmm.
software development. You'll hear of things like FDD, feature driven development, dynamic systems development. There's a host of branches of agile. And I'd say one of those that's most easily adaptable to non-software development is Scrum. And so that's the Scrum framework. So hopefully some people have heard of Scrum, but I love it. And so just as I'm an Agile evangelist, I am certainly a Scrum evangelist, because I believe what the Scrum framework does is it brings a layer of flexibility that we have been desperate for in more rigid functions, if that makes sense. And so when we think about kind of what is the Scrum framework, two of the people from the original 17 in the Agile Manifesto and the Agile Alliance got together and said, we'll put together a framework. And it wasn't intended to be rigid, but it does present a path toward implementing Agile. And that framework says if you employ these techniques, it's specialized, especially designed for, I'd say, complex problems, so large scale initiatives. It might be overkill for really small things that you're trying to deliver. But for larger scale components where you need the input of multiple stakeholders, where you have something where the outcome is not yet defined, you don't know what the answer is yet, you need to develop that solution, then Scrum might be the answer. And what they've done is they've also applied the Scrum framework well beyond software. So to your point, Fatima, there's this world where they've done it in the airline industry, in the manufacturing industry. It's been done just to manage your household improvement projects. And so lots of opportunity there and applicability, because the goal is, how do we ensure we're getting the right value and we're maximizing the value that we get? And so the Scrum framework, again, designed for complex initiatives, it's based on empiricism. And so we won't get into trying to walk through what that is. But the piece that matters,
Make it
right?
as simple as possible. Yes.
Right,
Just like
right.
trying to lay foundation
Just the piece
here.
that matters is there are three pillars, and that's transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And those should certainly resonate with most of us. The transparency part, it's just about making sure the right people have access to where you are in the project, have the opportunity to have conversations about the progress that's being made. When we think about inspection, it's not just having those conversations, but it's giving them the opportunity to say, actually, this isn't what we need, or the needs have changed. The business has evolved. The world that we operate in is so fast paced now that 2 weeks ago, perhaps that was the requirement, but now a new factor, internal or external, has risen and has prompted the need for change. And once we identify that need for change through inspection, then we adapt. And so that's the adaptation piece of it. And so I think starting there is incredibly important. There's three primary components of Scrum: Scrum events, the Scrum team itself, and Scrum artifacts. And so I won't try to turn you all into Scrum masters today. But what I do think we could focus on, one is just the concept of a sprint. And a sprint is just time-boxed series of things. So if I wanted to deliver a research project, for example, and maybe I'll use one that resonates a bit more with finance and accounting. Let's say if I want to develop a new process to comply with the new regulatory standard, lease accounting has come out. IFRS 16 is there, and we need to have new processes to be able to comply with that. We don't know what our end result will be. And so we might say, I need people from the policy team. I need people from the accounting reporting team. I need people from the internal control team or the internal audit team. So you're pulling people from multiple teams, and that challenges the notion of operating in silos. And so then you pull all of them together. They'll have one of three roles on this Scrum team. And that means they'll either be a Scrum master, a product owner, or a developer. And I love the simplicity, because it says if you're not the product owner, which is the person that's accountable for maximizing and delivering value, if you're not the Scrum master, which is effectively the person that's removing impediments, or that is ensuring that everyone adheres to the Scrum framework, if you're not one of those two individuals, everyone else is a developer. And that means you are contributing to some aspect of the development of the final product. In this scenario, the product is not a website or a new software application. The product might be the newly defined process that will allow our organization to comply with a new regulatory standard. And so in that scenario, then everyone from accounting policy, from financial reporting to other areas would serve as developers on the Scrum team. And they operate using the Scrum framework. And that means most of their work is delivered in sprints. And a sprint is either 1 to 4 weeks, usually a time box period. So you'll have the same time We might say we're going to have 2-week sprints and we've got 6 months to deliver this. And in those 2-week sprints, then we'll say at the end of the first sprint, we want to deliver these 3 things. At the end of the next sprint, we want to deliver these 3 incremental things. And there's something valuable and usable at the end of each of those sprints. So I'll pause there because that's a lot. But again, not trying to dive too far into the details, but I think it's important just to know what the roles are, the roles that finance and accounting professionals sometimes play when we're on a Scrum team as well.
So I think it's really, I have a question by Cecilia, which I'll share in a bit. But I think what you've, before going through that question, I think what you mentioned now about the scrums and the sprint and the roles in terms of a developer, product owner, and scrum master,
Yes.
maybe you can dive more into those because I think it's important for people to understand what are the roles of each, and even the sprints and the goals, because I know that there's several meetings when it comes to to Agile. Like you have sprint planning, sprint reviews, you have so many ones that not so many, there are like 5 main ones, but this is the bit where you really, I think it would be good to kind of really cover those.
Yes.
But before I go to that, let me first look at the chat because we got, hello, Cecilia. So Cecilia was asking, oh, thank you. I'm curious to understand how is the decision-making process following this Agile environment?
Yes.
That
This is a
is
good one.
It is actually a good one because it's very confusing because people's like, oh, who owns the decision and how does it
Yes.
work?
Yes.
And it
So
is
I'm
really,
ready.
especially in analytics, it's when you're doing an analytics project,
Yeah.
and you want to, it's like, okay, how do we run it? And who are responsible? So would you, I'll leave you to comment and then
This is good.
I'll come
It's
to
a
it.
perfect segue, though, to diving deeper into the roles of a Scrum team, because that'll give some insight there. So there's a good bit of autonomy that's given to a Scrum team to design the solution themselves. And I think that piece is important to know, but it doesn't mean they're operating without any guidance or governance altogether. So when we think about the product owner is accountable for overall product value, for the delivery of that value, for prioritizing the backlog to maximize that value. And the backlog is the list of everything that you need to deliver for that project. You may not have the answer for how it will be delivered yet. You may not have the answer for which specific components will feed into each of those pieces, but you might know if we need to comply with the regulatory standard, then perhaps one of the outcomes is what will be the new report that we need to submit for reporting purposes. Where will we source that data? Who will have to provide inputs to that, and what will the timeline be? So those are individual components that might sit on the backlog of delivering the ultimate product of we now have a new process that's ready to deliver and comply with the standard. And I use that example because in that scenario, the product owner decides what is the highest priority component of the ultimate product. The product owner decides what else do we need to do to deliver value? What's most valuable? How do we prioritize that? In my last role in industry, I was a product owner for RPA. So as the RPA, or robotic process automation product owner, we had a backlog of continuous improvement opportunities. And I was able to decide based on agreed upon, I'd say, criteria that the governing bodies supported. And the governing bodies in that scenario are just your finance and accounting leaders. So perhaps your controller in your organization, or the CFO, or the VP of finance, or some group of leadership team members. They will support in agreeing the parameters. They'll say, this is the criteria that we believe you should use for prioritization. These are the parameters you have. This is the budget you can't go outside of. This is the timeline, et cetera. And there may be 3 or 4 key parameters or key performance indicators that you agree up front. Beyond that, the product owner ultimately makes the decision for how value is delivered. And then the Scrum Master is not there to make decisions, but the Scrum Master is there to say, are we adhering to the Scrum processes in the framework? And if there are impediments that are, or blockers or barriers that are preventing the people that need to do the work from progressing, then I'm here to remove those if I'm the Scrum Master. So I'm a certified professional Scrum Master as well. And that's something that you're not making the decisions, but you're that liaison between the Scrum team and the rest of the stakeholders. And then developers are deciding in large part how the work gets done. So you ensure that a Scrum team is self-contained, which means we don't need to go to anyone outside the Scrum team to get the information that we need. If we need to develop a new application that will support how we're going to report, then the IT rep is on the Scrum team and is a developer. If we need someone to interpret the standard, then the person from the policy team is a developer and is on the team, such that it's multidisciplinary. And they can provide those inputs and those recommendations to the product owner. The product owner then decides and signs off. And then to your point, Fatima, about the events, there's a sprint planning meeting at the beginning of each individual sprint. And that's where the developers will say, based on the product backlog, these are the things that I believe I can fit in this sprint. And the product owner will say, that sounds good. Those are the most valuable and high priority pieces for today. Or they'll say, actually, that's lower priority. Don't work on those. The piece that's important is when we get to the sprint review. So a sprint review is where you're inviting stakeholders. And these might be your CFO or your VP of finance and those ultimate decision makers. And they have the opportunity there to inspect the work that's been done by the Scrum team and to provide feedback in real time, allowing the Scrum team to adapt for the next sprint.
So just to comment that, because that's Cecilia kind of really, that's like a follow-up question that she's asking. And I think you've covered it already here. And I just want to, she's speaking about corporate design and in that case, to legitimate it or changing the corporate design. And I just want to highlight what you've said now, really, Loreal, because you mentioned something really, the responsibility of the product owner is to manage the stakeholders. This is not the responsibility of the Scrum team or the Scrum Master. The product owner is the one who's responsible to coordinate with stakeholders across the organization. You don't change the organization structure to fit with Agile. He coordinates or she coordinates with these stakeholders and makes sure that their needs are taken into account. The Scrum Master, as you said, the job is just to be the person just unblocks the problem for the team, for the developers, makes sure that their life is simple, because it's not their job to go and they have a data that's not there. If they're doing an analytics project and they can't reach the data, or data is not uploaded in the data asset or whatever, then it's not their problem. It's that's the job of the Scrum Master that really goes and makes sure that that is sorted.
Yeah, and I'll throw one other bit of context in there, Fatima.
Please.
So there are a few organizations that I'm aware of, at least, that have gone much farther than that. And they've said, I will change my organizational structure and design it such that people have certain strengths and subject matter expertise, and they will form Scrum teams to deliver the things that need to be delivered. And that means they throw literally every activity for the finance function onto the backlog. That means month-end close activities are on the backlog. That means the processing of AR, processing of AP, ad hoc analytics projects are all on the backlog. And then there are small Scrum teams that work in support or in the progress toward the goals for those specific things. So that's, I'll qualify that with, that's the more radical approach, if you will. And so it's something that works, provided you've got the structures in place and the resources in place to be able to support that. What's more common is the model that Fatima described, where you still have departments, but there is an agreement amongst the leadership team in those departments. And so you might have a CFO, and then there's multiple teams or departments under the CFO or in the CFO function in your organization. And then they make sure that their leadership team agrees to committing to Scrum teams and creating bandwidth for their team members to be able to participate in Scrum teams. And then you've got scenarios where maybe it's continuous improvement initiatives that are on the backlog. And so they're still accountable for their regular work, but they've created space for these people to be able to work on Scrum teams. And then they partner together with people from different departments to accomplish improvement initiatives.
I think you're right. I think the bit that's so when it's a radical, well, it depends what it's a radical organization restructure, I guess. It's just like that's the bit where it gets a bit tricky. But definitely, I think it also depends on some, like this is something that I've discussed in another LinkedIn Live. It's also how you're structuring your analytics strategy. So is it a hybrid, or is it a centralized or decentralized? This is part of actually, so it's a bigger thing than having a radical change. And you say, well, you're just going to change the CFO, no CFO, no C. Well, there is a structure, But
Certainly.
to what extent, I think you're right, L'Oreal, because to what extent you're going to change it really depends on the vision of the company.
Right. What the
So
operating model
what
is,
the
that
operating
centralized.
model,
Yes, yes.
exactly. So you don't have to change it straight away, but I think look at the organization structure strategy in general and see how analytics fits in.
Yes.
Um, I love that discussion. I'm really enjoying
Yes.
that.
No, it's good. It's good.
um,
Amazing question, Cecilia. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you, Cecilia. And yeah, please, if you're watching this live, whether on YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter, just send the questions across and we'll make sure to answer them. One of the things that I want to cover is, I think before we go, is the events, or not the event, like the meetings, because we discussed the Scrum meeting. Well, there's the Scrums, there is the sprint planning, sprint review, and you have the
Yep.
retrospective. Those are the really main. Well, there are others, but those are the really main, the main events. And maybe we can
Right.
kind of really quickly explain to the people what
Sure.
each is.
Yeah. Yeah. You
So
ready?
yeah, let's do
All
that.
right, let's go. So there are 5 Scrum events.
Mm.
The first one we've already talked about, which is the sprint. And we call that the heartbeat of Scrum, if you will, because Scrum is nothing without the sprint.
Mhm.
And so that's this time box iteration, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks or so. And it's at the end of each sprint, an increment or a component of the final product is delivered. And that final product is not just a piece of it, but it's something that's actually usable, which is the true value
Yes.
there. So sprint is the first thing, and then everything else kind of surrounds the sprint. So sprint planning would be the first meeting that you'll have in a sprint. So if you've got a 2-week sprint, the very first day you'll have a sprint planning meeting, and that's where you're planning the work that's going to be performed in the upcoming sprint. The product owner is supporting their prioritization. You're answering 2 questions primarily: what can be delivered in the increment that's going to result from this sprint? And then how will the work needed to deliver, how will that work be performed? Needed to deliver that increment, how will that work be performed? So that's in the sprint planning. The next one that you have is a daily scrum. So traditionally, it's every day and it's only 15 minutes. And it's mandated that it's only 15 minutes because it's not intended to distract from the work that has to get done.
To be
But it
punchy.
is saying, yes, it's like, what are your problems? What's stopping you from getting your work done? What did you finish yesterday? What are you working on today?
Exactly.
Yes, really, really quickly. And so after that, so you're doing that on a daily basis. And I will say for teams in finance that have adapted Scrum to some of their projects, it may not be daily. You may have a 3-week sprint and perhaps the Scrum is twice a week or once a week. And so I will say I've seen adaptations of that from an implementation perspective where it's not practical to do the 15-minute Scrums, but the traditional scenario in the framework is a daily Scrum for 15 minutes. And then the sprint review is the next piece, which is at the end of each sprint. So either at the end of that week or 2 weeks. And in that session, you're reviewing what was done. And then the last one is the sprint retrospective, where you're reviewing how the work was done in that sprint. So how do you modify your ways of working?
Yes. I love how you've explained each of those 5 main events. And I think one of the things that is really good that you mentioned now, L'Oreal, is there are variations, because there is the Scrum methodology. I've worked in so many projects and I had so many variations depending on the team, the size of the projects. Like if the size of the project is small, and I've done it in organizations and I've done it for charities. And you can really feel like the vibe of the organization and the culture and how to get actually the team to get used to the. I remember in one of the teams, they continued calling the sprint as a milestone. And I was like, if that's how you start, okay, let's just start with this milestone. And by the end of it, they got, because it's just also tailoring it. You can't change.
Yes.
It's like all of a sudden you're like, you know what? We have sprints, we have scrums, we have this, da, 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 and a product owner. Where's the product? Where's the scrum master? And it's just so much change.
Yes.
Sometimes it's successful when you do the radical change, but sometimes you need to get people with you on the journey and walk
Yep.
them slowly through it and actually adapt even the terminology. So I loved how you said the variations, because I
Oh,
think
good.
it's really important um, to understand that those variations depend on the culture, on so many things.
Yep. Yep.
Um, So I think it really that's quite an interesting. We're already like that's already half an hour. I
Yes,
can't believe
yes,
it's.
yes. No, it's good. And what I'll throw out is just additional resources,
Yes,
conscious that
please.
it is about a half an hour. If you want to access any of the resources, and all of this is available for free to anyone,
Mhm.
you can go to myima.org/agile. And if you go there, you'll be able to see the full report that's been written that talks about how to adopt Agile within finance functions. It'll also talk you through not just the Agile methodology piece, but what it means to be an Agile finance organization. So the agility bit. And there's also in the October 2021 edition of Strategic Finance, one of the feature articles is your finance function Agile? And so you can access that at sfmagazine.com, or again, go to myima.org/agile.
So what I'm gonna do is after this event, if I'll just share those links. So if you share them with me, I'll
Yes,
just post them on the comments that people can link it.
certainly.
As much as you said it's more of a finance focus, to be honest, I've read the paper and I do data analytics in finance and outside of finance. And it is very relevant because I think
Yes,
if you're in finance, it's brilliant. You have examples in finance, but even if you're not in finance, you have a paper with an example in finance. So you can actually link the methodology to a real life example. And that's the
yes,
beauty of your paper, which what I loved. So I'll share the links in the comments. You can go and have a look at all the Institute of Management Accountants resources. And thanks again, L'Oreal, for the paper.
yes.
It was brilliant, and thanks for the discussion. I loved
Oh,
it.
it's been
Uh,
outstanding. Thank you for having me, Fatima.
Thank you, L'Oreal. So thank you everyone who joined today. And as I said, the resources, this video would be available on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube for a replay. Next month, I'll upload it on the podcast, and I'll share it on my LinkedIn. Again, thank you very much, L'Oreal. Really, really enjoyed it. And yeah, feel free to ask us any questions. Both of us will always be happy to answer.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. See you. Bye.